Okay, so now in our discussion of Asian American family formation and community formation, we can now begin to discuss the growth of Asian American communities, especially during the post 1965 era. Now, we know that in the past, Asian American history, that is to say, stretching back to the 19th century, spilling over into the early decades of the 20th century, well, we see that things like gender exclusion and citizenship exclusion prevented Asian American communities from growth. We don't see the significant growth, especially when compared to other immigrant communities from Europe or, say, Latin America. But certainly by post 1965, with the change in immigration law, coupled with the advent of a global economy after the restructuring of American capitalism, we see by the 1980s, 1990s, forces like chain migration, that's part of family reunification of the 1965 Act. Well, this is leading to widespread family formation. And therefore, you have a more contemporary idea of community formation. And, certainly Asian Americans, you see that significant mass population and family numbers that are increasing to the point where you could talk about community formation. Now, here I'm going to discuss community in a conventional sense, but also later I'll discuss it in a more abstract, sociological, and even a theoretical sense. So first, the more conventional sense of community is defined here on the slide. And you notice it says a body of people organized into a political, municipal, or social unity who share common interest. Now, obviously, this doesn't just pertain to ethnicity. You could talk about religious communities, certain professionals like doctors or engineers, or artist communities. You could talk about athletic communities, even, university and college students, right? That's a community too. Now, in terms of its conventional use, we most often associate communities with a definite geographical locality that incorporate people having that connection or affinity. And by the way, as I said later in our discussion, we'll discuss the ways to think about community that is not so strictly local or territorial. Now, with the post-1965 immigration flow from Asia, you see the formation of larger Asian ethnic communities compared to before, as we just mentioned. So within these spaces, the Asian immigrant can forge social capital. They can engage and make use of these ethnic networks and work to transform all this information and connections into tangible resources, and thus allowing economic mobility. So it's crucially important that, within these communities, not only do you have ethnic networks and ethnic capital, but also employment opportunities, while providing some familiarity and comfort even to these immigrants. Things like traditional food, cultural items that are from home, even clothes and things like that, that again makes the cognitive dissonance and perhaps even the culture shock that they may experience. It serves to assuage that shock. Right? So within such communities, you have newly arrived immigrants within the ethnic communities faced with much less barriers related to, say, language and culture. This makes integration easier. And again, by providing employment, for example, this hastens the integration of the immigrant into the national economy as a whole, right? Not just the ethnic economy, but the American economy as a whole. And of course, ultimately, this is crucial for the success of immigrants in the United States. Yet, at the same time, it is argued by some that ethnic enclaves actually isolate the immigrant population, which works against assimilation. It hinders assimilation, at the same time being productive to things like, let's say, civic engagement in the United States. Let's say politics, right? When you become so isolated, well, you tend to become less engaged with important issues that affect your life. Right? Another negative effect is seen in terms of the possibility of reproducing the conditions of inequality and even poverty, in this global economy where they occupy or they tend to occupy secondary positions in the segmented labor market. Now, I just mentioned that you have the influx of professionals, sure, but that's not all who's coming in. You also see immigrants that will occupy secondary labor positions, and especially since Asians tend to flock into the large urban areas. Let's recall that this is one major factor for the sharp rise in poverty levels among Asians today. So thus, within these ethnic communities again, it could make them vulnerable to unemployment, underemployment, exploitation by co-ethnics, right, within these communities. So, for example, ethnic communities supply immediate employment, that they also enter the segmented labor market, as I just explained, where mobility is drastically limited. Can such immigrants ever escape the secondary labor market? Right? It's a hard thing to do. And if you enter the community right away when you get here, the ethnic community, and you enter a secondary position, well, some say there's that glass ceiling again that they could never rise above. So, will they be trapped within these ethnic communities while less integrated into mainstream society? So, these implications are not just economic, but also cultural and political. So, again, you have this movement of Asian immigrant who used to cluster around the more inner parts of the city. This is before 1965, but eventually, by the 80s and 90s, especially with the advent of the professional managerial class coming in, who don't work the secondary jobs, but rather the primary jobs, well, you start seeing this movement from the inner cities to the suburbs. And there's a specific term used here by a social scientist. He called them ethnoburbs. And this term relates to, as mentioned there in the slide, suburban areas comprised of particular ethnic minority. And here you have the presence of ethnic capital, for example, restaurants, you have ethnic groceries, entertainment, that really cater to the minority population within that suburb. Okay, so this is what happens with the more socioeconomically mobile Asian Americans, the more affluent immigrants coming in from post 1965. And it makes sense to us because, they can afford these homes in the suburbs away from the city. And that marks them as, separate from the more secondary labor positions, right? So within these neighborhoods, it should be mentioned that assimilation theory, and we used even the word classical assimilation theory, it seems to apply less within the ethnoburb. Why is that? It's because Asian Americans in particular began recreating these communities with these clusters of ethnic businesses and institutions. For example, you see the mini malls being remodeled and replacing the older businesses with Asian businesses, shopping centers. And when you look at the signs there, the advertising signs, they're written in some Asian writing rather than English. And by the way, this will lead to outside criticism that Asian American newcomers were encroaching upon these established neighborhoods. See, they're attracting excessive numbers of so-called foreigners, right? And it's going to lead to things like English-only campaigns and the anti-growth movement, which we will discuss later in another slide.